A mountain man was forced to serve a poor maid, but no one in Cold Creek expected what happened next. It starts on a dusty frontier morning when the church bell rings and the townsfolk drag a gruff loner into the street. His punishment isn't jail. It's servitude to the poorest maid in town, a woman everyone overlooks, but who carries a secret she's terrified to reveal. At first he thinks it's simple chores, hauling water, chopping wood, swallowing his pride. But when a strange fever sweeps through the valley and he collapses in the dirt, burning with sickness, the truth breaks open like thunder. This maid isn't just a maid. She knows things no one else dares to understand, things that might save him, or expose a hidden danger creeping through the town. As she fights to keep him alive, someone in the shadows wants her silent, and him gone. If a maid can save the very man sentenced to serve her, then what terrible truth is powerful enough to destroy them both? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The autumn sun hung low over the jagged peaks as Jedediah Cole guided his tired horse down the narrow trail into Cold Creek. His mule followed close behind, its back laden with beaver and marten pelts from weeks of trapping in the high country. The animal's hooves kicked up small clouds of dust that caught the golden evening light. Jed's shoulders ached from the long ride, and his throat felt as dry as the wind-swept street before him. The saloon's weathered sign creaked on its hinges, beckoning with promises of warmth and whiskey. He dismounted stiffly, his boots hitting the packed earth with a dull thud. "Easy now," he murmured to the mule as he secured both animals to the hitching post. His fingers, rough from working trap lines, fumbled slightly with the reins. The street was quiet except for distant children's voices and the rhythmic pounding of a carpenter's hammer somewhere down the lane. The saloon's bat-wing doors groaned as Jed pushed through them. The familiar smell of stale tobacco and spilled beer wrapped around him like an old blanket. A handful of loggers huddled near the pot-bellied stove, their voices low but tense. Jed kept his head down as he made his way to the bar, his spurs jingling against the wooden floor. "Whiskey," he said to the barkeep, dropping a coin onto the scarred counter. The amber liquid splashed into his glass, and he savored the first burning sip. Behind him, the loggers' conversation grew louder. "3 more sick up at Marshall's camp," one said. "Fever's spreading faster than wildfire in August." "Ain't natural," another added. "Something in the water, maybe, or them Indian camps upstream." Jed's jaw tightened at the accusation, but he kept his eyes on his glass. He'd spent enough time with the native tribes to know better, but arguing wouldn't change minds already. Poisoned by fear. "Hey, mountain man," a logger called out. "You been upriver? Seen anything strange?" Jed took another slow sip before answering. "Nothing but beaver and bear sign." "That's what they all say," the logger sneered, moving closer. The man's breath reeked of cheap whiskey. "Protecting your trading partners, are you?" "Best move along," Jed warned quietly, but the logger was too far gone to hear the danger in his voice. A meaty hand grabbed Jed's shoulder. "I'm talking to you, trapper." Jed's reaction was instant. Years of wilderness survival had honed his reflexes, sharp as a hunting knife. He spun, his fist connecting with the logger's jaw, but the momentum of his turn, combined with the whiskey's warmth in his blood, threw him off balance. His boot heel caught on a loose floorboard, sending him stumbling backward. He crashed through the saloon's front window in an explosion of glass and splintered wood. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs as he landed hard in the street. But his momentum carried him further, right into a supply wagon parked nearby. The wagon rocked violently from the collision. Its back wheel, already loose from wear, broke free with a crack of stressed wood. Jed watched in horror as the heavy wheel bounced down the slight incline, heading straight for the town well. "No!" he shouted, scrambling to his feet. But it was too late. The wheel struck the well's stone wall with a sickening crunch. Chunks of ancient mortar and rock tumbled inward, splashing into the water below. A crowd gathered quickly, drawn by the commotion. "Lord have mercy," Aunt Millie Carter's voice cut through the growing murmurs. She stood in her apron, flour-dusted hands pressed to her chest. Her usually kind face was drawn with worry as she stared at the damaged well. Pastor Emmett Albright pushed through the crowd, his Bible still clutched in one hand as if he'd been interrupted in his evening devotions. "Stand back, everyone," he commanded, his deep voice carrying authority despite its gentleness. "We need to assess the damage." Jed was already moving toward the well, his boots crunching on scattered stone fragments. He peered down into the darkness, his heart sinking at what he saw. The wheel had knocked loose several of the larger foundation stones, and muddy water swirled below, filled with debris from the crumbling walls. "This is our only working well," someone in the crowd said, panic edging their voice. "What are we going to do?" Sheriff Benton Gray arrived, his badge catching the last rays of sunlight. His weathered face showed no emotion as he surveyed the scene, but his eyes were sharp with concern. "Someone fetch Judge Harrison," he ordered, "and get some torches lit. We need to see what we're dealing with." Jed reached down, trying to grasp the wagon wheel wedged against the well's inner wall. The stone shifted ominously under his touch, sending another shower of pebbles into the contaminated water. "Don't touch. Anything else," Sheriff Gray warned. "You've done enough damage for one day, Cole." The accusation stung, but Jed knew it was deserved. He straightened slowly, aware of the hostile stares surrounding him. The town's children pressed against their mothers' skirts, pointing and whispering. Men who'd nodded greeting to him just hours ago now looked at him with unveiled anger. Torches flared to life around the well, casting dancing shadows across the gathered faces. The flames reflected in the muddy water below, making it look like liquid fire. The wheel's spokes cast strange patterns on the well's remaining walls, like the bars of a prison cell. Jed stood alone in the circle of light, his clothes still dusty from the trail and now torn from his fall. Blood trickled from a small cut on his cheek where the window glass had caught him. But it was the weight of the town's collective gaze that made him feel truly wounded. This wasn't just about a broken well. In a frontier town like Cold Creek, water meant life itself. Without it, crops would wither, livestock would suffer, and the fever that was already claiming victims upriver would find even more vulnerable targets. He looked at the faces in the crowd, faces he knew from years of trading in Cold Creek. Aunt Millie, who'd always saved him a slice of pie when he came to town. Pastor Albright, who never failed to greet him with a kind word, even when Jed's clothes were trail-worn and his manner gruff. Sheriff Gray, who'd always treated him fairly, despite Jed's preference for mountain solitude over town life. Now they all stared at him as if he were a stranger, or worse, an enemy. The sound of boots on wooden boardwalks announced Judge Harrison's arrival. The old man's face was grave as he took in the scene. The broken well, the scattered stones, the contaminated water that had sustained Cold Creek since its founding. Jed stood straighter, ready to face whatever punishment the judge deemed appropriate. He was responsible for this disaster, whether he'd meant it to happen or not. The weight of that responsibility settled over him like a heavy winter snow, cold and inescapable. The torchlight flickered across the gathered faces, casting shadows that seemed to dance with anticipation of the judge's words. The night wind carried the scent of pine from the mountains, a reminder of the wilderness where Jed had always felt most at home. But now that wilderness seemed very far away, as distant as the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky above Cold Creek. The town held its breath, waiting for justice to be served, and Jed waited with them, knowing that whatever came next would change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The broken well stood as silent testimony to how quickly fate could turn, how one moment of carelessness could shatter not just stone, but an entire community's trust. A child whimpered somewhere in the crowd, and a mother whispered soft reassurances. The sound seemed to emphasize the gravity of what had happened. This wasn't just about Jed anymore. His actions had put everyone at risk, from the youngest babe to the oldest settler. The torches continued to burn, casting their unforgiving light on the scene as Judge Harrison stepped forward to deliver his verdict. Jed stood his ground, his shadow stretching long and dark across the damaged well that had become both his crime and his punishment. Judge Harrison's lantern swayed gently as he made his way through the parting crowd. Its golden light caught the worried faces of Cold Creek's citizens, casting long shadows across the muddy street. The old judge's boots crunched on scattered pieces of stone as he approached the damaged well. Laurel Bennett stood at the edge of the gathering, her empty wooden pail hanging uselessly at her side. She'd come for the evening water draw, same as she did every night for the boarding house. Now she watched the murky water below, knowing the boarders would have no fresh water for morning coffee or washing. "What happened here?" Judge Harrison's voice carried the weight of his office, despite his advanced years. His gray eyes moved from the broken well to Jed, taking in the trapper's torn clothes and bleeding cheek. Sheriff Gray stepped forward. "Brawl started in the saloon, Your Honor. Spilled out here. Mr. Cole crashed into Wagner's supply wagon, sent the wheel straight into our well." Jed cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I never meant— Intention matters less than consequence, Mr. Cole." The judge held his lantern higher, examining the damage. Loose stones shifted ominously, sending another shower of pebbles into the contaminated water. "This well has served Cold Creek for 15 years. Now look at it." "We need water," someone shouted from the crowd. "The creek's too far to haul from." "What about the fever spreading upriver?" another voice added. "We can't risk drinking dirty water." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered townspeople. Laurel clutched her pail tighter, knowing how quickly fear could turn a crowd ugly. She'd seen it before, in another town, when her father— Judge Harrison raised his hand for silence. "I understand your concerns. They will be addressed." He turned back to Jed. "Mr. Cole, you've been coming to Cold Creek for years. You've traded fairly, kept mostly to yourself. But this—" He gestured at the ruined well. "This requires more than a simple fine." Jed stood straighter, his face set. "I can pay for repairs. Repairs will take weeks, possibly months. Meanwhile, this town needs water." The judge's voice hardened. "The law allows me to sentence you to jail time for destruction of public property. However, I don't believe that would serve the community's interests." Relief flickered across Jed's face, quickly replaced by wariness as the judge continued. "Instead, I sentence you to 60 days of community service." Judge Harrison's eyes scanned the crowd, settling on Laurel. "You'll serve your time helping the poorest, hardest-working person in Cold Creek, Miss Bennett at the church boarding house." Laurel felt her chest tighten. "Your Honor, I never asked—" "No, you didn't," the judge agreed kindly. "But you work from dawn to dusk keeping that boarding house running, caring for travelers and townsfolk alike. Now you'll need help hauling water from the creek, among other duties. Mr. Cole can provide that help, while learning the value of the community he's disrupted." Jed's face darkened. "Forced servitude? I'm no man's servant." Then perhaps you'd prefer 30 days in jail? The judge's tone made it clear it wasn't really a question. The mountain man's jaw clenched. Laurel could see him wrestling with his pride, calculating his options. Finally, he gave a sharp nod. 60 days, he growled. But I work my own way. You'll work as Miss Bennet directs, Judge Harrison corrected. Sheriff Gray will escort you to the boarding house. You'll report there at dawn tomorrow. He raised his voice to address the crowd. Until the well is repaired, water will be hauled from the creek. Mr. Cole's service will help ensure the boarding house at least has what it needs. Laurel stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. Your Honor, I appreciate the help, but I never asked for this arrangement. Sometimes help comes in unexpected forms, Miss Bennet, the judge replied softly. We all must adapt in times of hardship. The crowd began to disperse, though some lingered to watch Sheriff Gray lead Jed toward the church boarding house. Laurel hurried ahead, her empty pail swinging. She needed to warn Aunt Millie about their impending guest. The boarding house kitchen was warm and bright when Laurel entered. Aunt Millie stood at the stove, stirring a pot of beans for tomorrow's breakfast. Land sakes, girl, where's the water? Aunt Millie asked, then noticed Laurel's expression. What's happened? Before Laurel could explain, heavy boots sounded on the back porch. Sheriff Gray entered, followed by a still scowling Jed. Evening, Millie, the sheriff said. Got a new helper for you and Miss Bennet. Judge's orders. Aunt Millie's eyes narrowed as she took in Jed's disheveled appearance. This about the commotion we heard? Mr. Cole here had an accident that broke the town well, Sheriff Gray explained. He'll be helping around the boarding house for 60 days as his sentence. Will he now? Aunt Millie's wooden spoon tapped against her apron as she studied Jed. And where's this helper supposed to sleep? Can't have him in the house with paying guests and respectable folk? The back shed should do, the sheriff suggested. It's got a roof at least. Jed's expression grew even darker, but he remained silent. Laurel noticed how he kept his hands loose at his sides, carefully non-threatening despite his obvious anger. I'll fetch some blankets, she offered quietly. Much obliged, Jed replied stiffly, the first words he'd spoken since entering the boarding house. Aunt Millie snorted. Well, don't just stand there looking fierce. Come along, I'll show you where you'll be sleeping. She led the way through the kitchen's back door, across the small yard to the storage shed. Laurel followed with an armload of worn but clean blankets, while Sheriff Gray and Jed brought up the rear. The shed was sturdy enough, with tight walls and only a few gaps in the roof. It smelled of old leather and hay. A broken plow took up one corner, and various tools hung from pegs on the walls. We can clear space here, Aunt Millie said, pushing aside some empty feed sacks. Get a cot from the attic, Laurel. No sense in him sleeping on the floor like a dog, even if he did break our well. Laurel hurried to obey, returning shortly with a narrow cot. It creaked when she set it up, but it would serve. She spread the blankets while Aunt Millie laid down rules. Breakfast at dawn. You'll eat in the kitchen before the paying guests wake. No tracking mud inside, no smoking in or near the buildings, and if I catch you bothering any of our lady boarders— You won't, Jed interrupted flatly. I aim to serve my sentence and be done. Sheriff Gray nodded, satisfied. I'll leave you folks to settle in. Remember, Cole, dawn tomorrow. After the sheriff left, an awkward silence fell. Aunt Millie broke it with a sharp clap of her hands. Well, that's settled. Come along, Laurel. These beans won't stir themselves. Laurel paused in the shed doorway, looking back at Jed. He stood beside the cot, looking strangely lost despite his imposing size. There's a pump out back for washing, she said softly, and I'll bring you some supper once it's quiet. He nodded once, not meeting her eyes. Thank you, Miss Bennet. Later that night, Jed lay on the narrow cot, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the boarding house. The blankets were clean but thin, a poor substitute for his warm bedroll. Through the shed's walls, he could hear Laurel's broom sweeping the hallway, a steady rhythm that seemed to mock his newly circumscribed world. How had one moment of anger led to this? He was a free man, used to answering only to himself and the harsh demands of the mountain wilderness. Now he was bound by a judge's word to serve a quiet slip of a woman who probably didn't know the first thing about real work. The sweeping paused, then resumed, moving further away. Jed shifted on the creaking cot, trying to find a comfortable position. 60 days. 2 months of taking orders, fetching water, and enduring the townspeople's stares. His pride rebelled at the thought, but his sense of honor, the same honor that had kept him trading fairly all these years, wouldn't let him break his word. A mouse skittered somewhere in the shadows. The shed's walls creaked as a cool night wind found the gaps. In the distance, a coyote called, reminding him of his beloved mountains. But those peaks were beyond his reach now, as distant as the stars he could glimpse through the holes in the roof. The sweeping sound had stopped. The boarding house settled into nighttime silence, broken only by the occasional creak of floorboards or murmur of voices. Jed stared into the darkness, understanding that his reckless moment in the saloon had changed everything. His freedom, his solitary life, his carefully maintained independence, all of it now stood as broken as the town's well. The pale light of dawn crept over Cold Creek as Laurel stood before the weathered shed door, her hand raised to knock. She hesitated, suddenly uncertain how to address the mountain man who'd become their unexpected helper. After a moment's pause, she rapped softly on the rough wood. "Mr. Cole?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Mr. Cole, it's morning." Movement rustled inside the shed, followed by the creak of the cot. The door opened, revealing Jed Cole looking stiff and uncomfortable in yesterday's clothes. His expression was guarded, a mixture of embarrassment and resignation clear in the set of his jaw. "Miss Bennett," he acknowledged gruffly. Laurel pulled a folded paper from her apron pocket. "I've made a list of what needs doing today." She handed it to him, careful to maintain a proper distance. "The most urgent task is water. We'll need at least 6 buckets from the creek for cooking and washing." Jed unfolded the paper, scanning the neat handwriting. "Creek's near a mile away," he observed, his voice neutral. "Yes," Laurel replied softly. "I usually make 3 trips before breakfast, but with the well broken—" She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "Breakfast is in 1 hour. The tools are in the shed, and there are empty buckets by the back door." Jed nodded once and tucked the list into his shirt pocket. Without another word, he strode toward the bucket line, his movements precise despite the previous night's uncomfortable lodging. Laurel watched him select 2 buckets before heading toward the creek path, his long stride eating up the distance. The morning air was crisp as Jed made his way through town. Early risers were already about their business, the blacksmith stoking his forge, the mercantile owner sweeping his porch. All paused to watch him pass, their gazes following his progress. He kept his eyes forward, ignoring their stares, though his shoulders tensed with each passing moment. The walk to Willow Creek took 20 minutes, the path winding past the edge of town and through a stand of cottonwoods. The water ran clear and cold, fed by mountain springs. Jed filled both buckets, the weight familiar to his calloused hands. The real test would be carrying them back without spilling. Returning through town proved even more challenging than his first pass. More people were about now, and conversation stopped as he approached. Outside the mercantile, Two women whispered behind their hands. Near the post office, a group of men paused in their discussion to watch him navigate the rutted street, water sloshing precariously in his buckets. Inside the boarding house kitchen, Laurel moved efficiently between the stove and work table, preparing breakfast for their guests. When Jed entered with the first water delivery, she looked up with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Cole. You can pour those into the large barrel there." She gestured toward a wooden container near the pump. "Would you like some cornbread? There's a bit left from yesterday's baking." The offer caught him off guard. He hesitated before nodding, watching as she wrapped a generous portion in a clean cloth. Their fingers didn't touch as she handed it to him, but something in her gentle manner made him pause. "Much obliged," he said quietly, tucking the cornbread into his pocket before heading out for more water. Throughout the morning, Jed worked his way through the list. After the water was done, he tackled the woodpile, the steady rhythm of the axe helping him ignore the occasional passers-by who slowed to watch. The fence rails took longer, requiring careful measurements and several trips to the lumber pile. From his various work positions, he couldn't help noticing Laurel's movements around the boarding house. She seemed to be everywhere at once, serving breakfast, changing linens, sweeping the porch. Once, as she carried a heavy tray of dishes, he saw her wince and press a hand to her lower back. The moment passed quickly as she hurried inside, but it stayed with him, a small tell of exhaustion she clearly tried to hide. The sun was low in the sky when a commotion near the kitchen door drew his attention. A small boy, no more than 6 or 7 years old, sat crying on the back steps while Laurel knelt beside him. As Jed approached with another load of wood, he could hear her speaking in calm, measured tones. "Let me see that knee, Tommy. We need to clean it properly to prevent suppuration." She examined the scraped flesh with professional precision. "The abrasion isn't deep, but we'll apply a poultice of yarrow to help with the bleeding and reduce risk of infection." Jed slowed his pace, struck by her unexpected use of medical terminology. The boy's sobs had quieted as Laurel cleaned the wound with water and what appeared to be witch hazel. Her movements were practiced, confident, far more knowledgeable than the usual treatment of scratches and scrapes. "There now," she said, wrapping the knee with a clean strip of cloth. "Keep this dry until tomorrow, and we'll check for signs of inflammation." "Yes'm," Tommy sniffled, accepting the piece of hard candy she pressed into his hand before scampering off. Laurel looked up to find Jed watching her. A flash of something. Worry? Fear? Crossed her face before she smoothed her expression and stood, brushing dust from her skirts. "The wood can go by the kitchen door, Mr. Cole. Supper will be ready in an hour." Later, after the evening meal was finished, and the guests had retired to the parlor, Jed brought his empty plate back to the kitchen. The door was partially open, lamplight spilling out into the darkening yard. He paused before entering, struck by the sight of Laurel bent over a book at the work table. It wasn't the dime store novel or ladies' magazine he might have expected. The volume was thick, bound in worn leather, its pages dense with text and detailed illustrations. A medical journal, he realized with surprise. Laurel's finger traced a diagram of what appeared to be anatomical drawings, her lips moving slightly as she read. At his inadvertent step forward, a floorboard creaked. Laurel's head snapped up, and in one fluid motion she closed the book and slid it beneath a stack of dish towels. When she turned to face him, her expression was carefully blank. "Did you need something else, Mr. Cole?" He held up his empty plate. "Just returning this." "Of course. You can leave it by the sink." She began wiping down the work table, her movement slightly too quick to be natural. "Breakfast is at dawn again tomorrow." Jed placed the plate where indicated, acutely aware of the hidden book and Laurel's obvious desire to conceal it. He nodded goodnight and stepped back into the gathering darkness, his mind turning over this new puzzle. A boarding house maid with medical knowledge and a secret text she clearly didn't want anyone to discover. The night air wrapped around Jed like a cool blanket as he stepped away from the boarding house kitchen. Stars pricked the dark sky above, but his mind remained fixed on what he'd witnessed inside. Laurel Bennett, a simple maid, studying what appeared to be an advanced medical text with the focus of a trained physician. He settled onto his cot in the shed, boots still on, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling. The image of her quickly hiding that leather-bound volume wouldn't leave him. There was more to Laurel Bennett than met the eye, and despite his usual preference for keeping to himself, Jed found his curiosity piqued. Sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of leather-bound books and secretive glances. Dawn arrived with Laurel's soft knock, earlier than usual. "Mr. Cole?" Her voice carried through the thin door. "I have a special errand for you this morning." Jed opened the door to find her already dressed for the day, her brown hair neatly pinned beneath a white cap. If she felt any discomfort about the previous night's encounter, her face didn't show it. "The mercantile opens early on Thursdays," she said, pressing a coin purse into his hand. "We need 10 pounds of flour before the morning baking starts." "What about the water hauling?" Jed asked, noting how she wouldn't quite meet his eyes. "That can wait until you return." She turned away quickly, adding over her shoulder, "Please hurry. Mrs. Peterson expects her morning biscuits promptly at 7 o'clock. The mercantile's bell chimed as Jed pushed through the door. Morning sunlight slanted through dusty windows, highlighting rows of dry goods and tools. Behind the counter, old Mr. Harrison was weighing sugar for a customer. Jonah Briggs, the logger. Jed had known Briggs casually for years, trading pelts for supplies. But the man before him looked different from their last encounter. Briggs' normally ruddy face had gone pale, and a wheezing cough interrupted his attempt to speak. "Morning, Cole," Briggs managed between coughs. "Heard about your trouble at the well." "News travels fast," Jed replied, stepping closer. "You're not looking your usual self." Briggs wiped his mouth with a handkerchief. "Something's going around up at the logging camp. Started with just a few men feeling poorly, but now..." He broke off into another coughing fit. "How many sick?" Jed asked, noting the sweat beading on Briggs's forehead despite the cool morning. "Half dozen, maybe more." Briggs lowered his voice. "Strange fever. Burns hot at night. Leaves a man weak as a newborn come morning. Doc Warren's been up twice, but he's stumped." He glanced around before adding, "Some are saying it might be something in the water upstream, where we're cutting." Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. "Now, Jonah, let's not go spreading wild theories. I'm sure it's just a seasonal fever." But Jed noticed the worry in the old shopkeeper's eyes as he measured out the flour. The town relied heavily on the logging operation. If something was truly wrong up there, everyone would feel the effects. Carrying the heavy sack of flour back to the boarding house, Jed's mind worked over Briggs' words. He'd seen the loggers kind of cough before, during his time in mining camps. The start of something that could turn deadly if not properly treated. He entered through the kitchen door to find the room empty, but voices drew him toward the parlor. There he discovered an unexpected scene. Laurel bent over Mrs. Albright, the pastor's wife, who lay pale and still on the settee. "The fever's climbing," Laurel murmured, pressing a cool cloth to the woman's forehead. Her movements were precise, professional, nothing like the uncertain touches of a concerned neighbor. Jed set the flour down quietly, watching as Laurel checked Mrs. Albright's pulse at the wrist, counting silently while watching the small clock on the mantel. Pastor Albright hovered nearby, worry etched on his face. "Should we send for Doc Warren?" the pastor asked. "He's up at the logging camp again," Laurel replied, her voice calm and assured. "But I can help make her comfortable until he returns." Jed stepped back into the kitchen, but continued observing through the partially open door. When she thought no one was watching, Laurel's demeanor shifted subtly. She pressed her ear to Mrs. Albright's chest, listening to her breathing with the methodical attention of a trained physician. Her fingers probed gently along the woman's neck, checking for swollen glands. "Rest now," Laurel instructed softly, helping Mrs. Albright sip water. "The willow bark tea will help with the fever. I'll check on you again in an hour." After the pastor had helped his wife upstairs to one of the boarding rooms, Jed found Laurel in the kitchen, washing her hands with particular thoroughness. "Where did you learn to do all that?" he asked quietly. Laurel's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't turn around. "Do what, Mr. Cole?" "Checking pulse against the clock, listening to breathing. Those aren't things most boarding house maids know." Her hands stilled in the wash basin. For a long moment she said nothing, and Jed could see the internal struggle playing across her reflected face in the window glass. Finally, she dried her hands and turned to face him. "My father," she began, then stopped, choosing her words carefully. "He used to teach me things about healing before he fell into disgrace." "What kind of things?" "Mr. Cole." Her voice took on an edge of desperation. "Please, I help where I can, with simple things only. But if people knew I had such knowledge—" She twisted the dish towel in her hands. "Women aren't supposed to know these things. The town already whispers about unmarried women who show too much learning. They'd say I was practicing medicine without permission, maybe even call it witchcraft." Jed thought of the hidden medical journal, her confident handling of the pastor's wife, the precise terminology she'd used with the boy's scraped knee. "Your father was a doctor?" "Please," she repeated, taking a step closer, her eyes pleading. "I'm begging you to keep this quiet. I only want to help people when the doctor isn't available. Nothing more." Something in her voice, the mix of fear and determination, struck a chord in Jed. He knew what it was to carry secrets, to help where you could while trying to avoid attention. "I won't say anything," he promised. Relief flooded her face, but Jed could see she was still guarded, still holding something back. There was more to her story than a disgraced father and borrowed medical knowledge. "Thank you," she whispered, then quickly changed the subject. "The water barrels need filling before lunch, and the chicken coop needs fresh straw." Jed nodded, accepting her obvious desire to end the conversation. But as he headed out with the water buckets, his mind churned with questions. What had happened to Laurel's father? Why was she so afraid of her knowledge being discovered? And most troublingly, with sickness spreading through the logging camp and now reaching into town, how long could she keep her abilities hidden? He glanced back at the boarding house, where Laurel was already hurrying upstairs to check on Mrs. Albright again. The morning sun caught her face for just a moment, highlighting both her beauty and her burden. A woman with healing in her hands, forced to hide her gift from a world that might condemn her for it. Evening shadows crept across the boarding house dining room as Laurel moved between the tables, refilling coffee cups. The usual quiet mealtime chatter had taken on a darker tone tonight, with worried voices discussing the spread of illness through the logging camps. 3 more men took sick just today, Abraham Foster said, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. The elderly carpenter had spent the afternoon repairing cabin roofs near the logging site. Young Pete Miller collapsed right in the middle of felling a tree. If his partner hadn't been quick, that pine would have crushed him flat. Across the table, Mrs. Peterson dabbed her mouth with a napkin. "I heard Doc Warren's been up there twice already this week. Says he's never seen anything quite like it." "What kind of symptoms are they having?" someone asked. Jed, eating quietly in the corner, noticed Laurel's hands grow still on the coffee pot as she listened. "Starts with chills," Foster continued, "then moves to the lungs. Terrible pain when breathing, they say. Then comes the fever and weakness. Some of them just collapse without warning, like young Pete did." Laurel's face had gone pale. The coffee pot trembled slightly in her grip as she set it down. "My cousin works the upper camp," Timothy Shaw added from his seat by the window. "Says men are dropping like flies. Never seen anything spread so fast." "Perhaps it's just a bad influenza," Mrs. Peterson suggested hopefully. But Laurel's expression suggested otherwise. She hurriedly gathered empty plates and disappeared into the kitchen. Jed watched her go, noting the rigid set of her shoulders and the way her hands shook as she carried the dishes. After the boarders had retired to their rooms, Jed found Laurel in the kitchen. She stood at the wash basin, staring out the window into the darkness, her hands submerged in soapy water but motionless. "You recognized something in those symptoms," he said quietly, closing the kitchen door behind him. She didn't turn around, but her shoulders tensed. "I shouldn't say anything. It sounds impossible." "Tell me anyway." Laurel dried her hands slowly on her apron, then reached beneath a loose floorboard near the stove. She withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age and dog-eared from frequent reading. "These are my father's notes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "From his time working with industrial medicine back east." She opened to a marked page and ran her finger down a list of symptoms. Chills, lung pain, sudden collapse, rapid spread. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. He documented cases near factories where workers were exposed to engineered fevers, deliberate contamination meant to drive people away from valuable land. Jed frowned. "Engineered fevers? You're saying someone's causing this sickness on purpose?" "I know how it sounds." Laurel closed the journal carefully. "I never thought I'd see it here. These kinds of tactics were used back east by unscrupulous businessmen trying to clear factory sites or railroad paths. My father treated the victims and documented everything, trying to prove what was happening." She swallowed hard. "It ruined him. No one believed his claims about manufactured illness. They called him a conspiracy theorist, stripped him of his medical license." "And you think something similar is happening here?" "The symptoms match exactly. And with the well damaged..." She met his eyes. "Think about it. This valley is becoming valuable with the railroad pushing west. There's timber, water rights, potential for development. What if someone wanted to drive people out?" Jed ran a hand through his hair, struggling with the magnitude of what she suggested. He'd seen greed and corruption in his years of wandering, but this level of calculated evil seemed almost beyond belief. Yet the fear in Laurel's eyes was real, and her father's notes were detailed and precise. "Who would have the knowledge to do something like this?" he asked. "Anyone with connections back east. Anyone who's traveled, who might have access to these industrial toxins." She wrapped her arms around herself. "I've been watching, trying to notice anything suspicious, but I have to be so careful. If people knew I was investigating, knew about my father's research..." "They'd run you out of town," Jed finished quietly. She nodded. "Or worse. These kinds of secrets can be dangerous." Through the window, the first hint of dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Soon the boarders would be waking, expecting their breakfast. Laurel quickly returned the journal to its hiding place and began stoking the stove. "Mr. Cole," she said softly as she worked, not looking at him. "While you're doing your chores today, would you keep watch? Notice if anyone's acting strangely around the well or the water sources? I know I have no right to ask, but..." "I'll watch," he promised. She gave him a grateful look before turning to measure coffee into the pot. The morning passed slowly as Jed worked on the broken fence rails behind the boarding house. He positioned himself where he could observe the town's main street, particularly the area around the damaged well. Mid-morning, he spotted Deputy Rourke making his way from building to building, questioning townspeople. The deputy's manner seemed casual enough, but Jed noticed how he kept circling back to the well. Several times, Rourke bent to examine the cracked stones, making notes in a small book. Normal enough for a lawman investigating damage to town property, perhaps, but something about his movements struck Jed as theatrical, as if he were putting on a show of investigation. Around noon, when the street was nearly empty as folks went in for their midday meals, Rourke's behavior changed. Looking furtively around, he approached the well again. This time, instead of just examining it, he produced several small glass vials and began collecting water samples. Jed kept hammering at the fence rail, maintaining his rhythm while watching through narrowed eyes. The Bishop deputy's movements had become quick and furtive. After filling the vials, Rourke reached into his coat and withdrew a small packet wrapped in brown paper. For a moment, he seemed to weigh it in his hand, then quickly concealed it again. The deputy straightened, brushed off his knees, and started to turn toward the boarding house. Jed quickly focused on his work, driving nails with careful attention. He could feel Rourke's eyes on him, but didn't look up until the deputy's boots appeared at the edge of his vision. "Making amends for your destructive behavior, I see," Rourke said, his tone smooth, but with an edge of contempt. "Yes, sir," Jed replied simply, keeping his face neutral despite the anger that flared at the deputy's condescending manner. "Just trying to make things right." "Indeed." Rourke studied him for a moment longer. "See that you stay focused on your assigned tasks. We wouldn't want any more accidents." The deputy turned and walked away, his hand unconsciously touching the spot where he'd hidden the mysterious packet. Jed watched him go, thinking of Laurel's warnings about engineered illness and dangerous secrets. What had he just witnessed? And more importantly, what should he do about it? The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of work and worried thoughts. As evening approached, Jed collected his tools, his mind churning with questions. He'd seen something suspicious, certainly, but was it evidence of the kind of deliberate contamination Laurel feared? And if it was, how could they prove it without exposing her knowledge and putting her at risk? He glanced up at the boarding house windows, where lamplight was beginning to glow as Laurel prepared the evening meal. Somewhere inside was her father's journal, documenting a pattern of illness that matched exactly what was happening in their valley. And somewhere in town was Deputy Rourke, carrying vials of well water and a concealed packet that might hold the answers to the spreading sickness. Heavy thoughts weighed on Jed as he stored the tools in the shed. He'd have to find a way to tell Laurel what he'd seen without being overheard. The dinner bell rang, calling boarders to their evening meal, and he could already hear voices inside discussing the latest news from the logging camps. More men had fallen ill today. Time was running out to uncover the truth. Dawn painted Cold Creek's buildings in pale gold as Jed saddled his horse behind the boarding house. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, though his mind raced with purpose. Through the kitchen window, he could see Laurel preparing breakfast, her shadow moving against the lamplight. "Heading to check my trap line," he called out when she appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. The excuse had been carefully chosen, reasonable for a mountain man, even one serving a sentence. Laurel's eyes held understanding. "Be careful," she said softly. "The morning's still cool." "Much obliged for the concern." Tipped his hat, aware they might be watched. "I'll be back before supper." He led his horse quietly through town, past the damaged well where Deputy Rourke's tracks from yesterday still marked the mud. The deputy himself emerged from the jail just as Jed reached the edge of town. Perfect timing, though Jed kept his face neutral, focused on adjusting his saddle as Rourke mounted up. The deputy rode north, and Jed gave him a quarter-hour head start before following. Years of tracking had taught him patience. He kept to the tree line, using the morning shadows for cover while maintaining sight of Rourke's dust trail. After an hour's ride, the deputy turned east onto an old railroad construction trail. Jed knew these paths. They led to temporary camps where workers had lived while laying track the previous year. Most were abandoned now, the railroad having moved on to more distant sections. Another mile brought them to a weather-beaten line shack. Rourke dismounted and went inside, emerging 15 minutes later with a cloth-wrapped bundle. He secured it to his saddle and rode off toward town, never suspecting the eyes watching from the pine grove. Jed waited until the deputy's horse disappeared around a bend before approaching the shack. The wooden door creaked as he eased it open, hand near his knife, though he expected no company. Dusty sunlight filtered through gaps in the walls, illuminating a simple interior. Broken chair, rusty stove, sagging cot. But it was the table that drew his attention. Scattered across its surface were torn brown paper packets, like the one he'd seen Rourke hide yesterday. A fine white powder dusted the wood, and empty glass vials lay discarded in one corner. Jed's instincts, honed by years of wilderness survival, screamed danger. He used his knife tip to scrape some powder into a clean envelope from his pocket, careful not to touch it. A forgotten diary on the table revealed columns of numbers and dates, water levels, temperatures, delivery schedules. Jed couldn't read all the words, but he recognized the pattern of someone tracking results. The air felt thick with secrets. He did a final sweep of the shack, noting fresh boot prints in the dust and recently disturbed floorboards. Whatever was happening here, it was current and organized. Satisfied he'd seen enough, Jed mounted up and took a circuitous route back to town. The noon sun was high when he returned to the boarding house. In the kitchen, Aunt Millie stirred a pot of stew while Laurel kneaded bread dough. The older woman's presence complicated things, but they couldn't wait. "Found something interesting on my trapline," Jed said carefully, setting his hat on its peg. "Might want to take a look, Miss Bennett. Could be affecting the local wildlife." Laurel's hands stilled in the dough. "I'll just wash up first." She glanced at Aunt Millie. "Would you mind watching this rise for a few minutes?" "Go on then." Aunt Millie waved her wooden spoon. "But don't be all day about it. These biscuits won't bake themselves." They stepped into the pantry, where rows of preserved foods provided privacy. Jed produced the envelope of powder. "Found this in an old line shack north of town. Rourke's been using it as some kind of base." Laurel's face paled as she examined the residue. "It matches what my father described in his notes. A crude agent created from industrial chemicals and local minerals. It can be added to water sources or spread through the air." Her voice dropped lower. "It doesn't kill quickly. That would be too obvious. Instead, it weakens communities slowly, driving people away with mysterious illnesses that no one can quite explain." "Why would anyone do such a thing?" "Control. Power. The same reasons my father uncovered back east." She wrapped her arms around herself. With the railroad expanding and land prices rising, someone could make a fortune buying up abandoned properties from sick settlers forced to leave. A crash from the kitchen made them both jump, just Aunt Millie dropping a pan, but it reminded them of the need for caution. "We need more evidence," Laurel whispered. "Something concrete that proves who's behind this. Otherwise we'll end up like my father, dismissed as crazy or worse." Jed nodded grimly. "I'll keep watching Rourke. Maybe trail him again tomorrow. Be careful. If he suspects— "Laurel Bennett," Aunt Millie's voice carried through the door. "These biscuits are ready for the oven." "Coming," Laurel called back. She gave Jed a meaningful look before hurrying to the kitchen. The afternoon passed in routine tasks, though tension hummed beneath the surface. As evening approached, Jonah Briggs's wife appeared at the boarding house door, worry etched on her face. "It's Jonah," she said, twisting her apron. "The fever's worse. He can hardly breathe." Laurel gathered her medicine bag, the one she kept hidden beneath loose floorboards, and followed Mrs. Briggs to their small home near the lumber mill. Jed went too, carrying fresh water and firewood as cover for his presence. Inside, Jonah lay on a narrow bed, his breathing labored. Two small children huddled in a corner, watching with wide eyes as Laurel examined their father. Her movements were practiced, professional, checking pulse, listening to his chest, testing his reactions. "The fever's taken hold deep in his lungs," she murmured, mixing herbs for a poultice. "We need to draw out the infection." Jed positioned himself near the door, watching through the window as darkness fell. He could see the street clearly from here, including anyone who might approach. Inside, Laurel worked steadily, her earlier fears hidden beneath calm efficiency as she tended her patient. Night settled over Cold Creek. A lamp burned in the deputy's office. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called. Jed's hand rested near his gun, knowing now that the valley faced an enemy more dangerous than any wild animal. Laurel knelt beside Jonah's bed, one hand holding his, the other pressed against her heart. Her lips moved in silent prayer as she watched him breathe. The moment stretched, heavy with the weight of lives at stake and secrets that could destroy them all. Mrs. Briggs dozed in a chair while the children slept on a pallet nearby. Jed maintained his vigil at the door, dividing his attention between the street outside and the quiet drama within. His muscles ached from the day's riding, but he ignored the discomfort. Right now, he was the only shield between this room full of innocent people and whatever evil had taken root in their valley. The clock struck 10. Jonah's breathing seemed easier, though his face remained flushed with fever. Laurel rose slowly, her own exhaustion visible in the slump of her shoulders. She checked the poultice one final time and mixed a fresh cup of healing tea. "Try to get him to drink this when he wakes," she instructed Mrs. Briggs softly. "I'll return in the morning to check on him." Outside, the night air carried a hint of autumn chill. Laurel gathered her skirts, preparing for the walk back to the boarding house. But first she paused, looking up at the stars scattered across the dark sky. "God help us," she whispered. "God help us all." Jed said nothing, but his presence at her side offered silent support as they made their way through the sleeping town. Both knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, more secrets to uncover, more lives to protect. But for now, they carried their knowledge like a heavy burden, watching and waiting for the right moment to act. In the distance, a train whistle echoed off the mountains, a reminder of the changes coming to their valley, changes that some would kill to control. Jed's hand tightened on his gun belt as he escorted Laurel safely home. Whatever came next, he knew there would be no returning to the solitary life he'd known before. The stakes were too high, and the enemy too dangerous to face alone. The morning sun barely cleared the mountains when Laurel stumbled into the boarding house kitchen. Dark circles shadowed her eyes from the long night tending to Jonah Briggs. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the coffee pot. Jed watched from the doorway, noting how she steadied herself against the counter. Without a word, he stepped forward and took the heavy pot from her grasp. "Let me get that for you, Miss Bennett." He poured the steaming coffee into a tin cup and set it before her. "Reckon you could use this after being up most of the night?" Thank you. Laurel wrapped her fingers around the warm cup. Jonah's fever finally broke near dawn. His breathing's easier now. Jed nodded, already reaching for his hat. I'll see to the morning chores. You rest a spell. Before Laurel could protest, he was out the door, striding toward the woodpile. The familiar rhythm of the axe soon filled the yard as he split log after log. When the first pile grew large enough for 3 days' worth of fires. He kept going, the steady thunk of steel against wood matching his heartbeat. The sun climbed higher. Sweat dampened his shirt, but Jed continued until a second mountain of split wood stood ready. His shoulders ached, yet seeing the impressive stockpile brought satisfaction. One less thing for Laurel to worry about. Next, he grabbed the water buckets. The creek lay a good quarter-mile from town, but Jed made 4 trips instead of the usual 2, filling every barrel and bucket he could find. Each time he returned, he caught glimpses of Laurel moving through the boarding house, serving breakfast to guests, changing linens, always in motion despite her evident fatigue. Near midday, while Laurel prepared lunch in the kitchen, Jed noticed the loose porch step that had been causing boarders to stumble. Without being asked, he gathered tools from the shed and set to work. The old nails came out easily enough, and he had just finished securing fresh boards when Laurel appeared in the doorway. "You didn't have to do all this," she said softly, gesturing at the repaired step, the towers of firewood, the full water barrels. "Needed doing." Jed shrugged, suddenly self-conscious under her gaze. A smile spread across her face, the first real, unguarded smile he'd seen since his sentencing began. Something warm stirred in his chest at the sight. "Well, I'm much obliged all the same," she said. "Would you like some lunch? The stew's just ready." They ate together in the kitchen, sharing comfortable silence as autumn sunlight streamed through the windows. When Aunt Millie bustled in with an armload of vegetables, Jed automatically rose to help, taking the heavy basket from her. "Land sakes," the older woman exclaimed. "You're turning right useful, Mr. Cole." Throughout the afternoon, Jed found himself working alongside Laurel with increasing ease. When Mrs. Patterson, their eldest boarder, complained of a swollen ankle, he followed Laurel's quiet instructions to fetch cool water and clean cloths. He watched as Laurel gently examined the old woman's joint, her touch professional, yet tender. "Just a mild sprain," she assured Mrs. Patterson. "We'll wrap it properly and have you comfortable in no time." Later, as they cleared away the medical supplies, Laurel paused. "Would you like to learn something useful?" she asked hesitantly. "Something that might help others?" At Jed's nod, she gathered herbs from her private stores and demonstrated how to prepare a simple fever-reducing tea. "The proportions matter," she explained, measuring carefully. "Too much can make a child sick, too little won't help at all, but when prepared right, it can bring real comfort." Jed's large hands seemed clumsy next to her delicate movements, but he concentrated on following her instructions exactly. The familiar scents of mint and yarrow filled the kitchen as she taught him the proper brewing time. "This would have been helpful during some hard winters in the mountains," he admitted, thinking of times he'd suffered alone through fever and injury. As evening approached, they prepared a pot of rich bone broth for the Briggs family. Laurel added extra vegetables and herbs, while Jed carried fresh bread from Aunt Millie's afternoon baking. The small Briggs home glowed with lamplight as they approached. Inside, they found Jonah propped up in bed, weak but alert, his children curled against him while his wife darned socks nearby. The family's gratitude filled the room like warmth from a hearth. "Don't know what we'd have done without you," Mrs. Briggs said, tears in her eyes as she accepted the food. "Both of you." Walking back through the cool evening, stars beginning to pepper the darkening sky, Jed glanced at Laurel's profile. The day's work had brought color to her cheeks, though weariness still showed in her steps. "Can I ask you something?" he ventured carefully. She nodded, drawing her shawl closer against the evening chill. "Do you ever miss him? Your father?" Jed kept his voice gentle, knowing he treaded on tender ground. "Despite what happened?" Laurel was quiet for several steps before answering. "Every day," she admitted softly. "He wasn't perfect, but he taught me everything I know about healing. Sometimes I wonder if learning medicine was a mistake, if it would have been better to simply be a proper lady like everyone expected." They paused at the boarding house steps, the night gathering around them. Jed considered his words carefully before speaking. "Seems to me it was the best thing he ever gave you," he said finally. "Your knowledge, your healing touch, they're gifts, the kind that make this world a mite better for those suffering in it." Laurel's eyes glistened in the lamplight, but she lifted her chin with quiet dignity. "Thank you, Mr. Cole. That means more than you know." They stood there a moment longer, the evening breeze rustling through turning leaves, while somewhere in the distance a whippoorwill called. Then Laurel opened the door, and they stepped back into the warmth of the boarding house, each carrying a deeper understanding of the other than when the day began. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with autumn frost silvering the boarding house window panes. Laurel had just finished setting out breakfast when urgent knocking echoed through the front hall. Pastor Albright stood on the porch, his weathered face drawn with worry. "Miss Bennett, forgive the early hour, but Martha's fever has returned something fierce," he said, twisting his hat in his hands. "She's asking for you." Laurel quickly gathered her medicine bag. "Of course, Pastor. Let me fetch my shawl." Jed, coming in from his shed with an armload of firewood, caught her eye. Without a word, he set down the logs and fell into step beside her and the pastor. The parsonage sat just behind the white-painted church, morning sunlight glinting off its windows. Inside, Martha Albright lay flushed and restless, her gray hair damp with sweat. Laurel moved with quiet efficiency, checking the older woman's pulse and breathing. "The infection's trying to take hold again," Laurel murmured, reaching for her bag. "But we caught it early this time." Her hands moved surely as she mixed a poultice of herbs, explaining each step to the anxious pastor. "The yarrow helps break the fever, while the comfrey draws out infection. We'll add willow bark tea for the pain." Jed watched from the doorway as Laurel tended to Mrs. Albright with gentle competence. Within an hour, the sick woman's breathing eased and her color improved. By mid-morning, she was sitting up, sipping broth and managing a weak smile. Pastor Albright's relief was palpable. When they stepped outside the parsonage, he clasped Laurel's hand between both of his. "The Lord surely guided your hands today, Miss Bennett," he declared, loud enough for passing townspeople to hear. "We're blessed to have such skill and kindness in our community." Color rose in Laurel's cheeks at the public praise. Several women leaving the general store paused to listen, their usual suspicious glances softening. Back at the boarding house, Jed collected tools and climbed to the roof, where loose shingles needed securing before winter storms arrived. The height gave him a clear view of town activity, women gathering at the well, children playing marbles in the dusty street, Laurel hurrying back and forth with supplies for her boarders. Each time she passed below, she'd glance up and wave, sometimes calling out a question or comment that made him smile despite himself. The easy friendship growing between them felt as natural as breathing. "Mind that loose board by the chimney," she called up once. "Wouldn't want our strongest worker laid up with a broken leg." "Much obliged for the warning," Jed replied, touching his hat brim. "Though I reckon you'd patch me up right quick if I did fall." Her laugh drifted up like music. Better not test that theory, Mr. Cole. Near midday, Jonah Briggs walked slowly past, leaning on a cane, but definitely improved from his worst days. He stopped to chat with Mrs. Peterson and her quilting circle on the mercantile porch. "That Miss Bennett's got healing in her hands, sure as sunrise," Jed heard him say. "Don't know where we'd be without her knowledge of fevers and such. My Sarah says she's an angel sent straight from heaven." The quilting ladies nodded, their usual gossip turning to praise of Laurel's dedication to the sick. Word of her medical skill spread through town like honey dripping from a comb, slow but sweet, and impossible to ignore. When Jed finished the roof repairs, he found Laurel in the kitchen preparing more medicines. She'd laid out neat rows of clean cloth strips and various dried herbs on the wooden table. "Could use an extra pair of hands," she said, glancing up with a smile. "If you're willing to learn more." Jed pulled up a chair, watching carefully as she demonstrated how to mix and wrap poultices. Her fingers moved with practiced grace, measuring portions precisely. "My father always said healing was equal parts science and art," she explained, showing him how to fold the cloths just so. "The proportions matter, but so does the care you take in preparation." They worked companionably through the afternoon, Jed's large hands growing more confident with the delicate task. The kitchen filled with the sharp, clean scent of herbs and the soft sounds of their quiet conversation. As dusk painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, heavy boots sounded on the porch. Sheriff Gray stepped into the kitchen, removing his hat politely. "Evening, Miss Bennett. Mr. Cole." He nodded to them both. "Wanted to stop by and thank you proper for all you've done for our townsfolk lately. Seems like half the valley's singing your praises, Miss Bennett." "I only do what anyone would," Laurel demurred, but her eyes shone at the recognition. The sheriff turned to Jed, his expression growing serious. "As for you, Cole, you've been keeping your nose clean since that business with the well. Keep it that way. Town's got enough troubles without adding more." "Yes, sir," Jed replied evenly, thinking of Rourke's suspicious activities but holding his tongue. The time wasn't right to voice those concerns. After the sheriff left, Aunt Millie served up a hearty supper of beef stew and cornbread. The boarding house slowly quieted as guests retired for the evening. Laurel remained in the kitchen, sorting herbs by lamplight, while Jed lingered over his coffee. "Would you hand me that jar of chamomile?" she asked, gesturing to a shelf above her head. As Jed reached for it, their fingers brushed briefly in the passing. Neither commented, but something warm and peaceful settled between them in the lamp-lit kitchen. "Sometimes I forget what it's like, having someone to talk to at day's end," Laurel admitted softly, measuring dried flowers into small paper packets. "Someone who understands about healing and helping." Jed watched her work, noting how the lamplight caught gold glints in her dark hair. "Reckon I'm learning more about both those things every day I spend here." She glanced up, meeting his eyes with a quiet smile that spoke of trust earned and respect freely given. They sat in companionable silence as she finished her task, the autumn night deepening beyond the windows, while a cricket chirped somewhere in the corner. The moment held no drama or grand gestures, just two people who'd found unexpected friendship in the midst of duty and service, sharing the simple piece of work well done, and another day survived together. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold as Jedediah Cole rode toward the abandoned line shack. His breath frosted in the crisp morning air, and frost crunched beneath his horse's hooves. He'd left before Laurel woke, leaving only a brief note about checking trap lines. The line shack hunched against the rising sun like a wounded thing, its weathered boards gray with age. Jed dismounted, tied his horse, and approached cautiously. The door creaked as he pushed it open, sending dust motes dancing in the weak light filtering through grimy windows. Inside, everything looked exactly as it had during his last visit. Scattered papers, empty tin cups, and the lingering smell of tobacco. Jed moved carefully, searching for anything he might have missed. Deputy Rourke's visits meant there had to be more evidence hidden somewhere. His boot heel caught on an uneven floorboard near the back wall. Kneeling, Jed ran his fingers along the edge, feeling a slight give. He worked his knife into the gap, attempting to pry it loose. The board suddenly splintered with a sharp crack. A cloud of fine, pale powder burst upward, catching Jed full in the face before he could turn away. He stumbled backward, coughing and wiping his eyes. "No," he whispered, his heart pounding as he realized what had happened. The same powder they'd found traces of before, the engineered fever's source. Jed staggered outside, gulping clean air. His head already felt strange, like cotton had been stuffed behind his eyes. Fumbling with the reins, he managed to mount and point his horse toward town. The ride back was a blur. Sweat soaked his shirt despite the morning chill, and the familiar trail seemed to shift and waver. By the time the boarding house came into view, his hands shook so badly he could barely grip the reins. He half fell from the saddle, catching himself against the porch railing. The world tilted sickeningly. Through the haze, he heard a gasp. "Jed?" Laurel's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Dear Lord, what's happened?" He tried to straighten, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. "Line shack," he managed. "Powder. Breathed it in." Cool hands touched his face, and Laurel's worried eyes swam into focus. "You're burning up already. The fever moves fast once it takes hold." She slipped under his arm, supporting him. "Come inside. Now." Together they stumbled through the front door. Aunt Millie emerged from the kitchen, wooden spoon in hand. "Land's sake, what's wrong with him?" she demanded. "He's sick, Aunt Millie. The fever. Help me get him upstairs to the empty guest room." Laurel's voice was steady, but held an edge of fear. They managed to guide Jed up the narrow stairs, though he tried to protest that the shed was good enough. The guest room was small but clean, with a brass bed and faded quilt. He sank onto the mattress, shivering despite the sweat running down his face. "Fetch Pastor Albright," Laurel told Aunt Millie, "and my medicine bag from the kitchen. Hurry." The older woman hesitated. "Maybe we should send for the doctor in Miller's Creek." "He won't get here in time. This fever moves too quickly." Laurel was already rolling up her sleeves. "Please, Aunt Millie, trust me." Something in her voice must have convinced the older woman, because she hurried out. Laurel turned back to Jed, her movements swift and sure as she loosened his collar and felt his pulse. "Your heart's racing," she murmured. "How long ago did you breathe in the powder?" "Hour, maybe less." Jed's teeth chattered. "Sorry, shouldn't have gone alone." "Hush, save your strength." She pressed a cool cloth to his forehead. "We'll talk about your foolishness later." Pastor Albright arrived just as Aunt Millie returned with Laurel's medical bag. The pastor's lined face creased with concern as he took in the scene. "Miss Bennett, perhaps we should pray first and then send for proper medical help," he suggested gently. Laurel straightened, meeting his gaze directly. "With respect, Pastor, we'll pray while I work. This fever has already killed in the logging camps. I won't stand idle and watch it take another life." The pastor blinked, unused to such directness from her. But before he could respond, Jed was seized by a violent coughing fit that left him gasping. "Aunt Millie, I need hot water, all the blankets you can find, and the copper wash basin," Laurel ordered, already measuring herbs from her bag. "Pastor, if you'll pray, I'd be grateful. But I must treat him now." To everyone's surprise, Pastor Albright simply nodded. "The Lord often works through willing hands," he said quietly, and began to pray, Laurel worked steadily as the afternoon deepened into evening. She mixed medicines, applied poultices, and monitored Jed's breathing with careful attention. When his fever spiked higher, she bathed his face and neck with cool cloths. When the coughing racked him, she helped him sit up and breathe steam laced with healing herbs. "Stay with me, Jed," she whispered once, when his eyes grew particularly glassy and distant. "Keep fighting." Aunt Millie brought soup, but Laurel could only coax Jed to swallow a few spoonfuls. His skin burned like a furnace, and his breathing grew more labored with each passing hour. As night fell, Laurel constructed a steam tent over the bed using sheets and the steaming wash basin. The herb-scented vapor filled the small space, helping to ease Jed's tortured lungs. She sat beside him, one hand resting lightly on his chest to monitor his breathing, her lips moving in silent prayer. Pastor Albright stopped by again after evening services. "How does he fare?" he asked softly. "The fever hasn't broken?" Laurel's voice was hoarse with exhaustion. "But he's still fighting." The pastor studied her face for a long moment. "You have a gift, Miss Bennett. Perhaps it's time we acknowledged that more openly." Before Laurel could respond, Jed's body went suddenly rigid. His eyes rolled back, and he began to convulse. "Aunt Millie!" Laurel shouted, lunging forward to keep Jed from striking his head. "Bring more blankets, quickly!" The older woman's footsteps pounded up the stairs as Laurel held Jed's thrashing form, tears streaming down her face. "Don't you dare leave us!" she whispered fiercely. "Don't you dare!" Lamplight flickered against the guest room walls as Laurel Bennett wrung out another cloth in the basin of cool water. Her fingers trembled with exhaustion, but she refused to stop. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, marking the late hour. Jedediah Cole lay burning with fever, his broad shoulders twitching as he fought through another round of chills. Laurel pressed the damp cloth to his forehead, her heart aching at his labored breathing. "Hold on," she whispered, smoothing back his sweat-dampened hair. "Just hold on." The steam tent she'd constructed caught the lamplight, creating strange shadows across Jed's face. Herbs floated in the copper basin beneath, releasing healing vapors into the enclosed space. Laurel checked the water temperature and added more hot water from the kettle she kept simmering on the room's small stove. Aunt Millie appeared in the doorway, her gray hair escaping its usual neat bun. "Child, you need rest yourself." "I can't leave him." Laurel's voice was hoarse from hours of work. "The fever's still rising." The older woman set down a fresh pitcher of water and plate of bread. "At least eat something. Won't do him any good if you collapse." Laurel managed a small smile. "Thank you, Aunt Millie." As if sensing their voices, Jed stirred restlessly. His eyes opened but held no recognition, glazed with fever. "Should have stayed. In the mountains," he muttered. "Safer there, alone." "You're not alone now." Laurel squeezed his hand. "I'm right here." He turned toward her voice but seemed to look through her. "Failed them all. Failed the town. Always fail." "That's not true." Laurel's throat tightened as she bathed his face again. "You've helped so many people since coming here." "No family left." His words slurred together. "No one to miss me. We would miss you." Laurel blinked back tears. "I would miss you." The night crept forward with agonizing slowness. Laurel measured doses of willow bark tea, supporting Jed's head as she helped him drink. She changed poultices, monitored his breathing, and prayed without ceasing. Dawn's first gray light was seeping through the windows when Pastor Albright returned. He paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. Medical supplies scattered across every surface, steam rising from the tent, Laurel still maintaining her vigil. "Miss Bennett," he said carefully, "the town is talking. This situation goes against proper conduct." Laurel straightened her shoulders, though exhaustion made them sag. "With respect, Pastor, I cannot abandon him. There are appearances to consider. A single woman, alone with a man through the night. Then let them talk." Laurel's quiet voice held steel. "I won't let him die to preserve appearances." Aunt Millie appeared behind the pastor, arms crossed. "Begging your pardon, Pastor, but ain't saving lives the Lord's own work? Seems to me that's exactly what she's doing." Pastor Albright shifted uncomfortably. "Well, yes, but—" "No buts. About it." Aunt Millie's tone brooked no argument. "That girl's using the gifts God gave her. Ain't nothing improper about that?" Before the pastor could respond, Jed began coughing violently. Laurel rushed to raise his shoulders, supporting him through the spell. When it passed, his breathing was more labored than ever. "I need more hot water," Laurel said, not caring who heard the fear in her voice. "And fresh herbs from my bag." The pastor watched as she worked, her movements sure despite her obvious exhaustion. After a long moment, he sighed. Perhaps you're both right. Carry on, Miss Bennett. I'll speak to the town council." Morning sunlight crept across the floorboards as Laurel continued her care. Jed drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes speaking clearly, sometimes lost in fever dreams. During one lucid moment, his hand found hers. "Why?" he whispered. "Why risk so much? For me?" Laurel's heart clenched at the genuine confusion in his voice. "Because every life has value. Because you're worth saving." His eyes cleared briefly. "Never had anyone care before? Well, you do now." She squeezed his hand. "So you have to fight. Promise me." But he had already slipped away again, his breathing growing more troubled. As the afternoon wore on, Jed's condition deteriorated sharply. His fever blazed higher, and the coughing fits grew worse. "Aunt Millie!" Laurel called, her voice tight with worry. "I need more water boiled quickly, and bring the last of the elderberry tincture from the kitchen." The older woman hurried to comply, as Laurel fought to keep Jed comfortable. She showed Aunt Millie exactly how to prepare the medicines, measuring doses with trembling hands. "There now," Aunt Millie soothed, watching Laurel's drawn face. "You're doing everything you can." "It has to be enough," Laurel whispered. "It has to be." Night fell again, bringing no relief. Jed's fever reached terrifying heights, his skin burning like a brand beneath Laurel's touch. She pressed cold cloths to his chest and neck, trying to cool him as he thrashed weakly. "Please," she prayed, her voice breaking. "Please don't take him. Not when I've just found him." The confession slipped out, unbidden, but Laurel couldn't deny its truth. Somewhere between their awkward beginning and this desperate night, Jed had become precious to her. The thought of losing him now was unbearable. "Stay with me," she whispered, pressing another cold cloth to his brow. "Hold on until morning. Please, just hold on." The night deepened around them as Laurel maintained her vigil, watching each labored breath and praying it wouldn't be his last. Outside, coyotes called to the rising moon, their cries echoing the ache in her heart. She had lost so much already: her mother, her father's good name, her place in proper society. The thought of losing Jed too made her chest constrict with fear. But she would not give up. She would fight for him through this endless night. No matter what the town might say. Aunt Millie dozed in the corner chair, but Laurel remained alert, counting each precious breath. She held Jed's hand and whispered promises into the darkness, willing him to keep fighting until dawn. The lamp burned lower, casting long shadows across the room. Laurel's world narrowed to the sound of Jed's breathing and the burning heat of his skin beneath her hands. She prayed with every fiber of her being, begging God to spare this man who had come to mean so much. The night crept forward toward morning, each moment balanced between hope and fear. Laurel pressed another cold cloth to Jed's brow and waited, watching for any sign of change. His life hung by a thread, and she held on with all her strength, refusing to let go. The first pale light of dawn crept through the boarding house windows, casting weak shadows across the sick-room floor. Laurel's hands trembled as she wrung out another cloth, her movements slowed by bone-deep exhaustion. Hour after hour she had maintained her vigil, watching Jed's shallow breathing and praying for any sign of improvement. Steam still rose from the copper basin, carrying the sharp scent of healing herbs. Dried flowers and medicine bottles cluttered every surface, testament to the long night's battle. Aunt Millie dozed in the corner chair, her normally neat apron wrinkled from hours of helping tend to their patient. Laurel pressed the fresh cloth to Jed's burning forehead, her own head bowing with weariness. "Lord," she whispered, "if you're listening, please help him." The morning light grew stronger, warming the floorboards beneath her feet. Jed's breathing remained shallow and uneven, his skin still radiating dangerous heat. Laurel checked his pulse again. Too fast, too weak. Her medical knowledge told her these next hours would likely determine whether he lived or died. "You've got to keep fighting," she murmured, smoothing back his sweat-dampened hair. "There's so much left undone." The town was stirring outside, wagon wheels on packed earth, distant voices calling good morning. But here in the sick room, time seemed suspended between one labored breath and the next. Laurel's world had narrowed to this space, to this man's struggle for life. She was adjusting the steam tent when she felt it, the slightest change in the air around them. Jed's breathing shifted, becoming less strained. Hardly daring to hope, Laurel pressed her hand to his cheek. The burning heat that had frightened her for so long was fading. "Aunt Millie!" Her voice cracked with emotion. "Aunt Millie, wake up!" The older woman startled awake, blinking in confusion. "What is it, child?" "His fever. I think it's breaking." Aunt Millie hurried over, laying her weathered hand against Jed's forehead. "Praise the Lord," she breathed. "The heat's falling away." Laurel's eyes filled with tears as she checked his vital signs again. His pulse was steadier, his breathing deeper and more regular. The terrible flush was fading from his face, replaced by natural color. A soft knock at the door revealed Pastor Albright, come to check on their patient. "Any change?" he asked quietly. "The fever's breaking," Laurel told him, wiping her eyes. "He's going to live." The pastor moved closer, studying Jed's peaceful face. "A miracle," he murmured. "No," Aunt Millie corrected firmly. "God's provision through this girl's knowledge. We've all witnessed his hand at work through her these past days." Pastor Albright nodded slowly. "Indeed we have. I was wrong to doubt, Miss Bennet. Your gift truly comes from above." Before Laurel could respond, Jed stirred. His eyes fluttered open, clear and aware for the first time in days. His gaze found Laurel's face and held it. "You're still here," he whispered hoarsely. Laurel's heart leaped. "Of course I am." She helped him take a small sip of water. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo." His weak attempt at humor made her laugh through her tears. "Did you stay all night?" "All night and day," Aunt Millie answered for her. "This girl hasn't left your side since you fell ill." Jed's eyes widened slightly. "How long?" "Nearly 2 days now," Laurel told him gently. "We almost lost you several times. The fever was very bad." He processed this information slowly. "You saved my life." "She surely did," Pastor Albright agreed. "Against considerable opposition, I might add. Miss Bennet stood her ground and insisted on treating you, regardless of what anyone might say." Color touched Jed's pale cheeks. "Thank you," he whispered to Laurel. "I'm much obliged." "You're welcome," she squeezed his hand. "But you need to rest now. You're still very weak." Aunt Millie shooed the pastor towards the door. "Come along. Let's let them be. I'll bring up some broth later." When they were alone, Jed tried to sit up but fell back against the pillows. "The shack," he said urgently. "The powder. We have to tell them." "Shh." Laurel pressed him back gently. "Not yet. You need to regain your strength first. But people are sick. Dying, maybe." His voice was rough with concern. "I know." She smoothed the blanket over him. "And we will expose the truth, I promise. But you can't help anyone until you're stronger." He subsided reluctantly, eyes already growing heavy. "You'll stay?" "I'll be right here," she assured him. "Sleep now. You're safe." Jed drifted off, his breathing deep and even. Laurel sat back in her chair, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of her exhaustion. Her muscles ached, her head throbbed, and her eyes felt gritty with fatigue. But her heart was lighter than it had been in days. The morning passed peacefully. Aunt Millie brought thin broth, which Jed managed to sip, and fresh water for Laurel to wash her face. Pastor Albright returned briefly with news that the town council had met and officially sanctioned Laurel's medical care, at least during the current crisis. Through it all, Jed slept deeply, his body beginning the long work of healing. Each time he woke, he seemed a little stronger, a little more alert. By late afternoon, he was able to sit up against the pillows and take several spoonfuls of stew. "Tell me true," he said during one wakeful period. "How close did I come?" Laurel hesitated, then decided he deserved honesty. "Very close. Your fever was dangerously high, if it hadn't broken when it did." He caught her hand as her voice trailed off. "I heard you, you know, through the fever dreams. Your voice kept calling me back when everything else was dark." Heat rushed to her cheeks. I couldn't bear to lose you." The admission hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was quite ready to voice. Jed's thumb brushed across her knuckles, the touch gentle despite his weakness. "Reckon I'm mighty glad you're stubborn," he said softly. She managed a small laugh. "Aunt Millie says it's my best and worst quality." "Saved my life, didn't it?" His eyes were warm on her face. "Though I expect you've caught considerable trouble for it." "Nothing I couldn't handle?" Laurel straightened his blanket, avoiding his knowing gaze. "The pastor spoke up for me in the end. Things will settle down. Until we expose Rourke's scheme." Jed's expression hardened. "That powder was meant to poison the whole valley. We can't let him succeed." "We won't," Laurel promised. "But first you need to heal. We'll face that battle together when you're stronger." He nodded reluctantly, already tiring again. "Together," he murmured, as his eyes drifted closed. "Like the sound of that." Laurel watched him sleep, her heart full of emotions she wasn't quite ready to name. So much had changed in just a few days. The awkwardness between them had dissolved, replaced by something deeper and more precious. As evening approached, Aunt Millie insisted on sitting with Jed while Laurel took some air. "You've been cooped up in here too long, child. Go watch the sunset. Clear your head a spell." Reluctantly, Laurel stepped out onto the boarding house porch. The evening air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of summer flowers from Mrs. Patterson's garden next door. She leaned against the railing, letting the breeze dry the perspiration on her neck. Her body felt drained, pushed beyond normal endurance by the long hours of nursing. But her mind was clear and determined. They had won this battle. Jed would live. But the larger fight still loomed ahead. Somewhere in town, Deputy Rourke was likely planning his next move. More people could fall ill if they didn't stop him. The sun sank toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Laurel watched it settle, drawing strength from its beauty. Whatever came next, she would face it. She had found courage she never knew she possessed, standing up to the town's judgment. She had saved a life using the medical knowledge that had once brought such shame. Most importantly, she was no longer alone in her fight. Jed would stand beside her when the time came to expose the truth. Together they would protect their town and its people, no matter the cost. The evening deepened around her as she stood on the porch, feeling both exhausted and strengthened. The worst danger had passed, but she knew with certainty that their struggles were far from over. There would be more battles ahead. For now, though, she savored this moment of victory. Behind her in the boarding house, Jed slept peacefully, growing stronger with each passing hour. It was enough for today. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but they would face them together. Sunlight streamed through the boarding house window, casting warm patterns across Jed's bed. He sat propped against pillows, color finally returning to his face after days of fever. Though still weak, his eyes were clear and alert as Laurel checked his temperature. "Much better today," she said, pressing the back of her hand to his forehead. "The fever's completely gone now." "Thanks to you." Jed caught her hand as she withdrew it. "I ain't forgotten what you risked to save me." Laurel's cheeks colored. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Jed said firmly. "Most would have left me to the doctor in Cedar Springs. You stood up to the whole town." She busied herself straightening his blankets. "Well, what's done is done. The important thing is you're recovering." Jed studied her face. "Something's troubling you." Laurel hesitated, then sat in the chair beside his bed. "I've been thinking about the powder you found, about why someone would want to sicken the valley." "Go on." "Father used to say that wherever there's mysterious illness, look for who profits from empty land." She twisted her hands in her lap. "With folks too sick to work their claims." "The land would be easy pickings," Jed finished grimly, "especially with the railroad coming through." "Exactly." Laurel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "And who's been particularly interested in land deals lately?" Before Jed could answer, boots thudded on the boarding house steps. Sheriff Gray appeared in the doorway, his weathered face creased with concern. "Glad to see you sitting up, Cole," he said. "Heard it was a close thing." "Sheriff." Jed nodded in greeting. "What brings you by?" Gray removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "Been meaning to mention, Deputy Rourke's been doing a lot of surveying lately. Says it's routine work for the territory office, but something don't sit right." Jed and Laurel exchanged glances. After a moment, Jed spoke carefully. "Might be connected to what I found at the old line shack, Sheriff." "Oh?" Gray's eyes sharpened. Jed described the hidden powder, the strange papers, Rourke's suspicious behavior. With each detail, the sheriff's expression grew darker. "That's mighty troubling," Gray said when Jed finished. "If what you're saying is true." "I saw it with my own eyes. Sheriff. Near killed me when I breathed it in." Gray straightened, settling his hat back on his head. "Reckon I'd better look into this myself. You two stay put, especially you, Cole. You're in no shape for more trouble." After the sheriff left, Laurel brought Jed some broth. "You should rest," she said. "You're still recovering." "Can't rest while Rourke's out there planning who knows what." But exhaustion was already pulling at him. Promise you'll wake me if anything happens? I promise. She smoothed his blanket. I need to gather some herbs from the garden. I'll be right outside if you need anything. The afternoon sun was warm as Laurel knelt in her small herb garden behind the boarding house. She was cutting fresh feverfew when voices drifted from behind the stable. Deputy Rourke and someone she didn't recognize. Taking too long, the stranger was saying. Railroad wants proof the valley's clearing out. These things take time, Rourke replied. Can't make it too obvious. Time's running out. If we don't drive these settlers away soon, the deal's off. It'll work. The well's contaminated, the powder's making folks sick. They'll leave. They better. Railroad's paying good money once this valley empties. Laurel's hands trembled as she gathered her skirts and crept back toward the boarding house. She had to tell Jed. This was the proof they needed. She found him dozing, but his eyes snapped open at her touch. What's wrong? I just overheard Rourke, she whispered, quickly relating the conversation. Jed struggled to sit up straighter. We have to stop him. You're not strong enough yet. Don't matter. He's probably destroying evidence right now. Jed swung his legs over the side of the bed. Help me up. Jed, please. Laurel. His voice was gentle but firm. People are dying. We can't wait. She bit her lip, then nodded. Supporting him with her shoulder, she helped him stand. He swayed slightly but remained upright. The sun was setting as they made their way downstairs. Aunt Millie was visiting her sister, leaving the boarding house quiet. Jed insisted on waiting in the shed where he'd been sleeping before his illness. He'll come looking for anything we might have found, he explained. Better to catch him in the act. They didn't have to wait long. As darkness fell, bootsteps approached the shed. The door creaked open, and Deputy Rourke slipped inside, holding a lamp. Looking for something? Jed's voice came from the shadows. Rourke spun around, his free hand dropping to his gun. Cole, you're supposed to be bedridden. Surprised to see me alive? Jed stepped forward, one hand braced against the wall for support. That powder of yours nearly did the job. I don't know what you're talking about. But Rourke's eyes darted around the shed, searching. We heard you talking behind the stable, Laurel said from the doorway. About driving settlers out for the railroad. Rourke's face hardened. You've got no proof. The line, shack, Jed started, won't exist by morning. Rourke's smile was cold. Accidents happen. Lanterns tip over. Whole buildings burn, sometimes with people inside them. He lifted his lamp meaningfully. This boarding house is mighty old. Dry timber. Would be a shame if anything happened while everyone was sleeping. You wouldn't, Laurel gasped. Try me. Rourke's eyes glittered in the lamplight. I've worked too hard to let a mountain man and a disgraced doctor's daughter ruin everything. Jed took a step forward, despite his weakness. You'll have to go through me first. Not much of a challenge in your condition. Rourke raised the lamp. Last chance to forget what you know. The lamplight threw harsh shadows across his face, illuminating the ruthless determination in his eyes. The chapter ended with that tense tableau, Rourke holding the lamp like a weapon, Jed standing unsteadily between him and Laurel, and the fate of Cold Creek Valley hanging in the balance. The lantern trembled in Rourke's grip, its flame dancing dangerously close to the shed's timber walls. Jed stood his ground despite his weakness, while shadows flickered across the deputy's desperate face. Laurel suddenly rushed forward, placing herself between Rourke and the dry wood. Stop! You will not burn down my home! Get back! Rourke snarled, raising the lantern higher. Fire! Help! Aunt Millie's voice boomed from the boarding house porch, making them all jump. Someone fetch the sheriff! The deputy's gone mad! The clatter of boots and voices filled the night as townspeople emerged from their homes. Pastor Albright arrived first, his Bible still clutched in one hand. Others followed, ranch hands, storekeepers, families who'd been preparing for bed. Rourke's composure cracked as the crowd grew. "Stay back. These two are traitors. They're spreading lies about me." "The only liar here is you," Jed said firmly. "Tell them what you did to the water. Tell them about the railroad money." "He's delirious from fever," Rourke spat. "This woman's filled his head with nonsense." Sheriff Gray pushed through the gathering crowd, his hand resting on his gun belt. "Lower that lantern, Rourke. That's an order." "You don't understand," Rourke's voice rose sharply. "I was protecting our interests. The railroad needs this land." "By poisoning innocent people?" Jed reached carefully into his coat, withdrawing several paper packets. "Found these at the line shack. Same powder that nearly killed me." Laurel stepped forward, her voice steady despite her fear. "It's an engineered illness, something my father documented back east. Industrial saboteurs used it to drive people from valuable land." She faced the crowd. "The fever isn't natural. It was deliberately spread to empty the valley." Gasps and angry murmurs rippled through the gathered townsfolk. Jonah Briggs pushed forward, his face still pale from his own bout with the fever. "My children nearly died from that sickness. All for railroad money," Sheriff Gray said grimly. "How much were they paying you, Rourke?" The deputy's eyes darted wildly between faces, searching for sympathy and finding none. With a sudden oath, he hurled the lantern toward the crowd and bolted. Jed lunged to catch the lantern, while Laurel and Pastor Albright helped others stamp out scattered flames. Sheriff Gray drew his pistol, but before he could fire, Jonah Briggs stepped into Rourke's path. Despite his weakness, the logger tackled the deputy hard to the ground. "That's for my kids," Jonah growled, pinning Rourke until Sheriff Gray arrived with handcuffs. The metallic click of the cuffs closing seemed to break something in Rourke. "You're all fools," he shouted as Gray hauled him up. "The railroad's coming whether you want it or not." "Maybe so," Sheriff Gray said, "but they'll deal fairly with us now." He nodded to several men. "Help me get him to the jail." As they led Rourke away, the tension drained from Laurel like water from a broken dam. She swayed on her feet, exhausted from days of treating the sick and nights of worry. Jed caught her elbow, steadying her despite his own weakness. "You both need rest," Aunt Millie declared, shooing away the lingering crowd. "Pastor, would you mind seeing everyone home? There's been enough excitement for one night." Pastor Albright nodded, guiding people away with gentle words of reassurance. Soon only Aunt Millie remained, watching Jed and Laurel with concern. "The valley's safe now," Laurel whispered, fighting to keep her eyes open. "It's finally over." "Thanks to you," Jed said softly. "You never gave up." "Neither did you." She managed a tired smile before her knees buckled. Jed tightened his grip on her arm, while Aunt Millie quickly took her other side. Together they supported Laurel as the last light of day faded from the sky, and the first stars appeared above the quiet valley. Morning sunlight streamed through Cold Creek's telegraph office windows as the operator's keys clicked steadily, sending messages to territorial authorities about Deputy Rourke's arrest. The sharp tapping sound carried across the street where Jed and Laurel walked together, her medical basket swinging gently from her arm. Though still showing signs of his recent illness, Jed moved with growing strength. He carried the heavier supplies while Laurel visited homes where the fever had left families weak but healing. At each stop, she dispensed medicines and hope in equal measure. Sheriff Gray met them near the Mercantile, his weathered face etched with regret. "Miss Bennett," he said, removing his hat, "I should have seen through Rourke sooner. Your courage saved this valley." "We all want to protect our home," Laurel replied softly. "That's what matters now." They continued their rounds until Pastor Albright hurried over, his face bright with purpose. Laurel, the church board met this morning. We want you to lead a proper clinic in the annex. No more hiding. Your gift. Tears welled in Laurel's eyes as she nodded gratefully. Outside Jonah Briggs's cabin, his wife Sarah pressed a basket of fresh eggs into Laurel's hands. For healing our family, she insisted, while their children waved from the doorway. By afternoon, Jed was back at work on the boarding house porch. Laurel sat nearby in a wooden chair, watching him replace worn boards. "Those nails are a bit crooked," she teased gently. "Reckon they'll hold just fine," Jed replied with a slight smile. Later, they walked to the town well, where workers were fitting new stone blocks into place. The sound of hammers rang out as the crew strengthened the walls that would protect Cold Creek's water for years to come. As sunset painted the sky in soft gold, Jed turned to Laurel beside the well. His voice was quiet but sure. "My 60 days are nearly done," he said. "But if you're willing, I'd like to stay on, not as your servant, but as a man hoping to find his place here. By your side." The warmth in Laurel's eyes gave him hope as she looked up at him, the future stretching bright before them both. Evening shadows lengthened across the boarding house parlor as Laurel sat beside the crackling hearth, her father's medical journal open but unread in her lap. Jed's words from earlier echoed in her thoughts, stirring hopes she'd long kept buried. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the worn floorboards as she traced the journal's leather binding, remembering all the paths that had led her here. The wooden floor creaked softly as Jed entered the parlor. He moved carefully, still favoring his left side from the fever, but his eyes were clear and warm. In his weathered hands, he held something small wrapped in a clean handkerchief. "Made this while I was getting my strength back," he said quietly, settling into the chair beside her. He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a delicately carved wooden bird, its wings lifted as if ready to take flight. "Figured we could all use a reminder that hope takes wing, even in hard times." Laurel cradled the carving, feeling the smooth grain beneath her fingers. "It's beautiful, Jed." "Been thinking on what my father used to say," he continued, his voice low and earnest, "that a man's worth shows in how he helps build something lasting. This valley needs healing, needs what you can give it." "I was so afraid," Laurel admitted, "of people discovering my knowledge, of being driven out like father was. But now—" She met his steady gaze. "I trust you completely, Jed. More than I've trusted anyone since losing him. Then let me help you build this clinic, protect what you're creating here. These folks need someone who'll treat them with dignity, settlers and native families alike." His rough hand found hers, gentle and sure. "I aim to be that someone, working beside you." The kitchen door swung open as Aunt Millie bustled in carrying a steaming pot of stew. She took in their clasped hands with a knowing smile, but said only, "Supper's ready, you two? Can't heal folks on empty stomachs." After they'd helped clear the dishes, Jed lifted a lantern from its hook by the door. "Mind walking with me a spell?" Outside, cricket song filled the cool evening air. They strolled beneath the stars, talking of possibilities, examining rooms in the church annex, herbal gardens to plant come spring, a small house they might build near enough for emergency calls. "Never thought I'd find a place to belong again," Jed said softly, "or someone to share it with." Laurel turned to face him, her eyes bright in the lantern light. "We'll build it together. This clinic, this home, this life." He set the lantern down carefully, then drew her into a gentle embrace. She rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. In that moment, beneath the vast Montana sky, their shared future felt as real and solid as the earth beneath their feet. Golden autumn sunlight warmed the valley, as workers set the final stones around Cold Creek's new well. The reinforced walls gleamed with fresh mortar, standing broader and stronger than before. Across the street, a steady stream of patients made their way to Laurel's clinic in the church annex, where shelves of dried herbs and neat rows of supplies lined the freshly whitewashed walls. Jed rode in from his morning patrol, dust coating his boots, but contentment settling deep in his bones. These past months as Valley Scout had given him purpose beyond what he'd ever known in his solitary trapping days. He helped settler families find safe passage through mountain passes and worked with Lakota travelers to maintain peaceful routes through shared hunting grounds. Near the clinic steps, old Wicasa Red Elk waited in the shade, having traveled down from the high country to trade medicines with Laurel. His weathered face creased in a smile as Jed dismounted. "The valley grows strong again," Red Elk said, gesturing toward the bustling street. "Like new grass after fire, the people remember how to help each other." "Much of that's thanks to Laurel," Jed replied, removing his hat respectfully. Red Elk nodded. "She has good medicine, not just in her hands but in her heart. And you, my friend, have found your true path protecting both peoples who share these lands." Inside the clinic, Laurel finished wrapping a child's sprained wrist while his mother looked on gratefully. Her gentle efficiency spoke of growing confidence in her calling. When she spotted Jed and Red Elk, her face brightened with welcome. As the sun began its westward slide, townsfolk gathered in the churchyard, where Pastor Albright stood beside the new well. His deep voice carried across the crowd as he offered thanks for restored health and unity. "Let this well stand as a reminder," he proclaimed, "that from disaster can come healing, and from division can come strength. We are blessed by those among us who chose courage over fear, service over self." Laurel's fingers twined with Jed's as they stood among their neighbors. Aunt Millie dabbed her eyes with her apron, while Jonah Briggs, now fully recovered, nodded in solemn agreement. Even the sheriff removed his hat in respect. Red Elk stepped forward to offer a traditional blessing in his native tongue, then translated, "May this water bring life to all who drink, and may the hearts of the people flow together like streams joining into one river." As twilight painted the sky in deep purples and blues, the gathering slowly dispersed. Jed and Laurel lingered by the well, watching lanterns being lit along the street. The soft glow reminded Jed of that first night when his reckless actions had changed everything. "You know something?" he said softly, drawing Laurel closer. "Serving you was meant to be my punishment. Turned out to be the greatest gift I ever received." Laurel smiled up at him, love and contentment clear in her eyes. Together they walked toward the boarding house, their path lit by warm lamplight. Behind them, the new well stood as a testament to restoration, while ahead lay a future built on the foundations of grace, healing, and love. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.